Part 1, a bargain made in desperation, expanded, approximately 700 words. The wind moved slowly across the wide stretch of land, brushing over dry grass and weathered fences as if it too had grown tired of the silence. Caleb Turner stood on the porch of his ranch house, one hand resting against a wooden post worn smooth by years of sun and storms. The land around him was vast open skies, rolling fields, and distant hills, but for all its beauty, it carried a quiet emptiness that echoed. Deep within him, he had built this life with his own hands. Every fence post, every stable beam, every corner of the small house behind him told a story of hard work and persistence, but none of it filled the stillness that greeted him every night. No voice called his name. No laughter drifted through the rooms. Just the steady ticking of time and the lonely creak of floorboards. So when the letter came, he read it more than once. It wasn't written in elegant words. In fact, it felt rushed, almost careless. A man from a distant town was offering his daughter in marriage. There was a small dowry involved, but that wasn't what caught Caleb's attention. It was the line that explained everything and nothing all at once. The girl is deaf and does not speak. She will not be trouble. Caleb had set the letter down after reading that line, staring out across his land as the sun dipped low. It felt wrong, like a transaction, not a beginning. But the truth lingered in his mind longer than he cared to admit. He was alone. And perhaps she was. 2 days passed before he made his decision. Not quickly, not lightly. But eventually he wrote back with a simple agreement. Now, standing on his porch, he wondered if he had made a mistake. A small wagon approached in the distance, its wheels turning slowly against the dirt path. Caleb straightened, his chest tightening with a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. This was real now. There was no turning back. The wagon came to a stop in front of the house. A man climbed down first, his clothes wrinkled, his posture unsteady, though he tried to hide it. Caleb didn't need to hear him speak to understand the kind of man he was. There was a carelessness in his movements, a lack of attention that made Caleb uneasy. Then the girl stepped down. She moved carefully, gathering her simple dress as her feet touched the ground. For a brief moment, she didn't look at anyone. Instead, she glanced around the house, the fields, the sky, as if taking everything in at once. Caleb found himself watching her more closely than he expected. She didn't appear frightened, nor did she seem broken. There was something steady about her, something calm that didn't match the situation. When her eyes finally met his, they held a quiet awareness, sharp, observant, and deeply present. "This is Eliza," the man said, his voice rough. Caleb nodded, though his focus remained on her. Eliza didn't speak. She simply gave a small, polite nod, her hands folded gently in front of her. There was no hesitation in her movements, no confusion. If she truly could not hear or speak, she carried it with a grace that surprised him. The exchange between Caleb and her father was brief. A few words, a handshake, and then the man was already climbing back into the wagon, eager to leave. Caleb watched him go, a faint unease settling in his chest. Something about it all felt too quick, too easy. When the wagon disappeared into the distance, the silence returned, but it felt different now. He turned back toward Eliza. She stood near the edge of the porch, her gaze drifting over the ranch once more. The sunlight caught in her hair, giving it a soft glow, and for a moment she seemed almost out of place here, like something gentle placed in a world too rough for it. Caleb cleared his throat. Unsure of how to begin, he gestured toward the house, offering a simple, welcoming motion. Eliza watched him carefully, then nodded again. Without a word, she stepped forward, passing him quietly as she entered the house. Caleb remained where he was for a moment longer. He had expected many things: awkwardness, discomfort, even regret. But what he felt instead was something he couldn't quite name. A sense that this quiet girl carried more than anyone had told him. And as he finally turned to follow her inside, one thought lingered in his mind. Maybe this wasn't just an act of desperation. Maybe this was the beginning of something he didn't yet understand. Part 2. Silence between them expanded, approximately 700 words. Morning arrived gently over the ranch, with soft golden light stretching across the fields and slipping through the thin curtains of the small house. Caleb was already awake, as he always was. Routine had long been his companion long before any thought of sharing his home with another person, but today felt different. He sat at the wooden table, a cup of coffee warming his hands, listening to the faint sounds of the world outside, the wind, the distant shifting of horses in the stable. Inside the house, however, there was something new. Another presence. He glanced toward the hallway, where the door to the spare room remained closed. Eliza had gone there the night before without a word, carrying her small bag, her movements quiet and self-contained. Caleb hadn't known what to say then, and he still didn't now. After a moment, the door slowly opened. Eliza stepped out, her posture straight, her expression calm. She had already tied her hair back neatly, and her simple dress was clean, as though she had prepared herself carefully for the day ahead. She paused when she saw Caleb, her eyes meeting his briefly. Caleb stood up, unsure of the right approach. He gave a small nod, then gestured toward the table, pointing to the extra plate he had set out. Breakfast wasn't anything special, just bread, eggs, and a bit of fruit, but it was more effort than he usually made for himself. Eliza followed his gesture, stepping closer. She sat down quietly, her movements controlled, almost practiced. For a few moments, neither of them moved. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was unfamiliar. Caleb tried to think of a way to communicate. He tapped lightly on the table, then pointed to the food, raising his eyebrows slightly as if to ask, "Is this okay?" Eliza watched him carefully. Then, after a brief pause, she gave a small nod and reached for the bread. It was a simple exchange, but something about it felt fragile, like they were both stepping onto uncertain ground, unsure how much weight it could hold. As they ate, Caleb found himself observing her. Eliza didn't rush. She ate slowly, thoughtfully, as if she was aware of every movement she made. Her eyes moved, often not randomly, but with purpose. She seemed to notice everything, the faint crack in the wall, the way the sunlight shifted across the table, even the small ticking sound of the clock above the door. Caleb frowned slightly. It struck him as unusual. He had been told she couldn't hear, and yet there was something about the way she reacted to her surroundings. It felt attentive in a way he couldn't quite explain. He pushed the thought aside. After breakfast, Caleb stood and gestured toward the door, signaling that he needed to get back to work. He hesitated, then motioned gently toward her, then toward the house, trying to suggest that she could rest or stay inside. Eliza watched him, then shook her head softly. Instead, she pointed toward the yard. Caleb blinked, surprised. "You want to help?" he asked instinctively, though he knew she wouldn't hear him. Still, she seemed to understand the question. She nodded once, firmly. For a moment, Caleb wasn't sure what to do. He had imagined she might keep to herself, at least at first. But there was no hesitation in her stance, now only quiet determination. He gave a small nod and returned. Out in the yard, the day unfolded slowly. Caleb worked as he always did, checking fences, tending to the animals, but now there was someone else moving alongside him. Eliza didn't need instructions. She watched him once, twice, and then began to mirror his actions with careful precision. When he handed her a tool, she took it without confusion. When he pointed, she followed, and always she watched, not just him but everything. At one point, as Caleb adjusted a loose board near the stable, a horse shifted behind them, letting out a soft, low sound. It was barely noticeable, something Caleb himself almost ignored, but Eliza turned immediately. Her reaction was subtle, just a slight turn of her head, but it was instant. Caleb paused. He looked at her, then at the horse, then back at her again. She had already returned to her task, as if nothing had happened. Caleb said nothing, but something in his mind quietly stirred. The rest of the day passed in much the same way, silent, steady, and strangely connected. They didn't speak, didn't share words or laughter, but there was a rhythm forming between them, built on glances, gestures, and unspoken understanding. As the sun began to set, casting warm orange light across the land, Caleb leaned against the fence, watching Eliza as she stood a few steps away. She looked out over the fields, her expression calm, almost peaceful, for the first time in a long while. The silence of the ranch didn't feel empty, but it also didn't feel simple anymore, because now, Caleb couldn't shake the quiet thought forming in his mind. There was more to her silence than he had been told. The days settled into a quiet rhythm, the kind that didn't need to be spoken aloud to be understood. Morning light, shared meals, long hours of work, and soft evenings beneath open skies. Caleb had lived this routine for years, but now, with Eliza beside him, even the familiar began to feel different. Not louder, not brighter, just more alive? Eliza moved through each day with the same calm presence she had shown since her arrival. She never rushed, never hesitated, and never seemed uncertain of her place. Though she spoke no words, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that slowly began to ease the tension Caleb hadn't realized he was holding. Still, there were moments small, almost unnoticeable, at first that began to linger in his thoughts. One afternoon, Caleb was working near the far fence line, repairing a section that had loosened after a windy night. Eliza was nearby, gathering tools and stacking them neatly without being asked. The air was still, the world quiet, except for the occasional rustle of dry grass. Caleb dropped a hammer. It slipped from his hand unexpectedly, hitting the ground with a dull but distinct thud. Before he could even react, Eliza turned, not slowly, not by chance, instantly. Her eyes moved directly to the hammer, then to him as if she had heard it. As clearly as he had, Caleb froze for a moment. He bent down, picking up the tool, his gaze flicking back to her. She had already returned to her task, her expression unchanged, her movements steady. Maybe it was coincidence, he told himself that. But later that same day, something else happened. They were inside the barn, the air filled with the soft, familiar sounds of animals shifting in their stalls. Caleb moved quietly between them, checking feed and water. Eliza stood a few steps away, brushing down one of the horses with slow, careful strokes. Behind her, a small wooden door creaked open. It was an old hinge, one Caleb had meant to fix for weeks. The sound it made was faint, barely more than a whisper in the air, but Eliza paused. The brush in her hand stilled for just a second. Then she glanced back over her shoulder. Caleb noticed. This time he didn't look away. He watched her closely, his brow tightening ever so slightly. She didn't seem startled or confused, just aware. As if the sound had reached her naturally, without effort, yet she had never once acknowledged any voice. Never reacted when he spoke, never turned when he called her name. Only these small things. That night, Caleb sat alone at the table again, the same place where their quiet mornings began. Eliza was in the other room, likely preparing for sleep. The house was still wrapped in the soft hush of evening, but Caleb's mind wasn't at rest. He replayed the moments over and over, the hammer, the creaking door, even the way she seemed to notice distant sounds out in the field. It didn't make sense, or maybe it made too much sense. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. If she could hear, why wouldn't she respond? Why pretend? The questions pressed against his thoughts, but something stopped him from asking them. Not uncertainty, not even doubt. Respect. There was a quiet boundary around Eliza, something unspoken but clearly there. She had never hidden in fear, never acted helpless. If anything, she seemed in control of her silence, as if it were a choice, not a condition. And Caleb wasn't ready to break that. The next morning, he decided not to watch her, not to test her. Instead, he acted as he always had. But awareness has a way of changing things, even when nothing outwardly shifts. As they worked side by side, Caleb became more attentive, not obvious, not intrusive, just observant. He noticed how Eliza's head tilted ever so slightly when distant thunder rolled across the horizon, how her gaze flickered toward the sound of wind brushing harder against the barn doors, how once, when he stepped behind her more heavily than usual, her shoulders tensed just before he came into view. Each moment was small, each one easy to dismiss, but together they formed something undeniable. Still, Caleb said nothing, because despite the questions building quietly within him, something else was growing too, trust. Not the kind built on answers, but the kind built on patience. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft gold and amber, Eliza stood near the edge of the field watching the horizon. Caleb joined her, keeping a respectful distance. For a while, neither of them moved. Then, without looking at him, Eliza gave a faint, almost unnoticeable smile. It was brief, but real. And in that moment, Caleb realized something important, whatever her silence meant. It wasn't emptiness. It was something deeper, something she was choosing to carry. And for now, he would let her keep it. Part 4, A Gentle Connection, expanded, approximately 700 words. The ranch no longer felt like a place that simply existed. It felt lived in, not in loud, obvious ways. There were still no long conversations echoing through the halls, no music drifting from room to room, but something softer had taken root. Something steady. The kind of presence that didn't demand attention, yet quietly filled the spaces that once felt empty. Eliza had become part of the rhythm. Each morning, she was already awake by the time Caleb stepped into the kitchen. Sometimes she would be arranging the table, other times simply standing near the window, watching the light stretch across the land. She always acknowledged him with a small nod or a faint smile, simple gestures that, over time, began to feel like something more. Like understanding. Their communication remained wordless, but it had grown easier. Where there had once been hesitation, there was now a quiet flow. Caleb no longer second-guessed every gesture, and Eliza seemed to anticipate what he meant before he fully expressed it. A glance could become a question, a movement could become an answer. One afternoon, as the sun hung high and warm in the sky, Caleb found himself working on something new. It wasn't urgent and it wasn't necessary. In truth, he wasn't entirely sure why he had started, but he kept going anyway. Near the side of the house, where the soil was softer and the wind gentler, he cleared a small patch of land. The work was slow and deliberate, removing stones, loosening the earth, shaping the space with care. Eliza noticed. Of course, she always did. At first, she simply watched from a distance, her expression thoughtful. Then, without a word, she stepped closer. Caleb glanced up briefly but didn't stop working. After a moment, she knelt beside him. He paused. Surprised. She pointed to the ground, then to the small cloth bundle in her hands, a bundle he hadn't seen her carry before. Carefully, she unfolded it, revealing a handful of seeds. Caleb blinked. He hadn't expected that. Eliza looked at him, waiting, not uncertain, but quietly asking permission. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He nodded. Together, they began to work. There was no need for instruction. Eliza pressed the seeds into the soil with gentle precision, covering them carefully as Caleb prepared the rows. Their movements fell into sync, each one complementing the other without effort. It was simple, but it felt meaningful. Days passed, and the small patch of land began to change. Tiny green shoots pushed through the soil, fragile but determined. Eliza checked on them often, sometimes early in the morning, sometimes just before dusk. She never rushed the process. She simply tended. Caleb found himself watching her more during these moments. There was a softness in her expression when she knelt beside the growing plants, a quiet kind of joy that didn't need to be spoken aloud. It was different from the calm composure she usually carried, lighter, more open. One evening, as the sky shifted into shades of orange and pink, Caleb returned from the far side of the ranch to find something unexpected. The table inside the house had been set, not just placed, but arranged. There were small details he couldn't ignore, the way the plates were aligned neatly, the way a simple cloth had been laid across the center, even a small bundle of wildflowers placed in a jar. Eliza stood nearby, her hands lightly resting against the back of a chair. When she saw him, she didn't look away. Instead, she gestured gently toward the table. Caleb hesitated for just a moment, then stepped forward. As they sat across from each other, something shifted again. This wasn't just sharing space anymore. This was intention. He reached for a piece of bread, then paused, glancing at her. For a brief second, he wasn't sure why, but something about the moment felt different. Eliza noticed. She gave a small nod, as if encouraging him. Caleb let out a quiet breath and took a bite. It was such a small thing, and yet it felt like a step forward. After dinner, They stepped outside together. The air had cooled, carrying a soft breeze across the fields. The stars were beginning to appear, scattered across the darkening sky. Elisa moved a few steps ahead, her gaze lifting upward. Caleb joined her, following her line of sight. For a while they stood there in silence, but it wasn't the same silence. As before, this one felt shared. Comfortable. Alive. Elisa glanced at him briefly, then back at the sky. A faint smile touched her lips, gentle, unguarded. Caleb didn't say anything. He didn't need to, because in that quiet moment, beneath the wide open sky, something had become clear. They were no longer two strangers learning how to exist in the same space. They were becoming something more. Not through words, but through patience, through presence. Through all the small unspoken things that slowly, quietly, turned silence into connection. The storm rolled in slowly, like a quiet warning stretched across the horizon. By late afternoon, the sky had turned a muted gray, clouds gathering thick and heavy above the ranch. The wind picked up first soft at the beginning, then stronger, pressing against the walls of the house and whispering through the gaps in the barn doors. Caleb had seen enough storms to recognize the pattern. This one would last through the night. He finished his work earlier than usual, securing anything that might be carried off by the wind. By the time he stepped inside, the first drops of rain had begun to fall, light at first, tapping gently against the roof. Inside, the house felt warm. Eliza was already there, placing a lantern on the table. The soft glow lit her face, casting gentle shadows along the walls. She glanced at Caleb as he entered, her expression steady as always, but something about the moment felt different. Maybe it was the storm, or maybe it was everything. Caleb had been quietly noticing over the past days. They ate dinner as they usually did, across from each other, in calm silence. But tonight, Caleb found it harder to ignore the thoughts that had been building in his mind, the small signs, the way she turned at certain sounds, the way she seemed to notice things she shouldn't. He hadn't asked before. He had chosen patience, but now he wasn't sure if silence was still the right choice. A sudden crack of thunder echoed in the distance. It was louder this time. Closer. The lantern flickered slightly. Eliza's hand paused for just a fraction of a second. Caleb saw it. Clear. Undeniable. She had heard it. He set his cup down slowly. Eliza, he said, his voice calm but firm. He hadn't said her name often, not out loud. There had never been a reason to, but now the word felt heavy in the air. Eliza didn't respond. She kept her gaze lowered, her hands still, her posture composed. Another rumble of thunder rolled across the sky, closer now, vibrating faintly through the walls. Caleb stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't step too close, but he didn't look away either. Eliza. This time it was softer. Gentler. The kind of call that wasn't meant to confront, but to reach. For a moment, nothing happened. The storm outside seemed to pause with them, the steady rhythm of rain filling the silence between each heartbeat, and then Eliza lifted her head. Her eyes met his. Not confused. Not distant. Present. Fully, undeniably present. Caleb felt something shift inside him. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to, because in that single look, the truth had already surfaced. Eliza stood slowly. Her hands moved slightly, as if she were about to gesture like she always did. But then she stopped. The familiar motions faded before they formed. For the first time since she had arrived, she hesitated. A soft breath escaped her lips, and then, quietly, carefully, I heard you. The words were barely above a whisper, but they were clear. Caleb didn't move. He simply stood there, letting the moment settle around them. There was no shock in his expression. No anger, only a quiet understanding, as if a piece of something had finally fallen into place. Eliza lowered her gaze again, her fingers curling lightly against the fabric of her dress. I didn't mean to lie, she said softly, her voice unsteady but real. I just didn't know how else to be. The rain grew heavier outside, tapping steadily against the roof, filling the spaces where words paused. Caleb took a slow breath. You could have told me, he said, not accusing, just honest. Eliza nodded faintly. I know. She looked up. Again, her eyes holding something deeper now, something more vulnerable than anything he had seen before. Where I came from. Speaking didn't help, she continued. No one listened. Not really. It was easier to be silent. Safer. Her voice didn't break, but the weight behind it was clear. Caleb. Listen. Really listen. Not just to the words, but to what they carried, the quiet years behind them, the choice behind her silence. He stepped a little closer, but not enough to overwhelm the space between them. You don't have to be silent here, he said. Eliza's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to respond, but no words came right away, because this wasn't something that could change in a single moment. Silence had been her shield. Her way of surviving. Letting it go wouldn't be easy. Caleb understood that. So he didn't push. He simply nodded once. Steady and patient. We'll figure it out, he added quietly. Outside, the storm continued, but inside, something had shifted. The silence between them was no longer a mystery. It was a choice. And now it was one they could face together. The storm passed some time before dawn. By morning, the sky had cleared into a soft, pale blue, and the land seemed washed clean, as if the night had quietly carried something away with it. The air felt lighter, fresher. Inside the house, however, the quiet felt different, not heavy, not uncertain. Just new. Caleb was already awake, sitting at the table with his usual cup of coffee, but he hadn't touched it much. His thoughts were elsewhere, still lingering in the moment from the night before. Eliza's voice. Soft, careful, real. He hadn't imagined it. And now that he had heard it, he knew something had changed between them. Not broken, just opened. The sound of light footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up as Eliza entered the room. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. There was a quiet awareness in the air, like both of them understood that things couldn't go back to the way they were before. Eliza stepped closer to the table, her hands lightly holding a small notebook and a pencil. Caleb noticed. He didn't say anything. He simply waited. Eliza sat down across from him, her movements slower than usual, not hesitant but thoughtful. She opened the notebook and stared at the blank page for a moment, as if deciding where to begin. Then, gently, she started to write. The sound of the pencil against paper was soft, steady. Caleb watched, giving her the space she needed. After a minute, she turned the notebook toward him. Her handwriting was neat, careful, each word placed with intention. It was never that I couldn't speak. Caleb read it slowly. Then he looked up at her. Eliza met his gaze, then nodded faintly, encouraging him to continue. He looked back down. When I was younger, I used to talk a lot. I thought if I explained things, if I said them clearly, people would understand me. The words felt simple, but there was something beneath them. Something heavier. Caleb turned the page slightly, signaling for her to go on. Eliza took a breath, then continued writing, but no one really listened. Not my father, not anyone. My words didn't matter to them. Her hand paused for a moment, then she added another line, so I stopped using them. Caleb's chest tightened slightly. He glanced up again, but Eliza wasn't looking at him now. Her eyes were lowered, focused on the page, as if it were easier to share this way. Safer. He understood that. He didn't interrupt. Eliza turned the page and continued. When people think you can't hear, they stop expecting things from you. They stop arguing. They stop raising their voices. It becomes quiet. The last word lingered on the page. Quiet. Caleb leaned back slightly, letting the meaning settle. This wasn't just about silence. It was about control. About choosing peace. In a world that hadn't given it to her, he looked at her again, more carefully this time. You were protecting yourself, he said gently. Eliza's eyes lifted. She didn't nod right away, but something in her expression softened. After a moment, she gave a small, almost relieved nod. Caleb let out a slow breath. I don't blame you, he added, and he meant it. There was no anger in him. No sense of betrayal. If anything, he felt something closer to respect because what she had done. It wasn't weakness. It was survival. Eliza's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the notebook. She seemed to be thinking, weighing something. In her mind. Then, quietly, she spoke again, not writing this time. I didn't know if it would be different here. Her voice was still soft, but steadier than the night before. Caleb didn't hesitate. "It is," he said simply. There was no force in his tone. No pressure, just certainty. Eliza held his gaze for a moment, searching for something, perhaps doubt, perhaps expectation, but she didn't find it. Only calm, only patience. Her shoulders eased slightly. That small shift didn't go unnoticed. Caleb reached for his coffee, finally taking a sip. The familiar warmth grounded him, but his attention never fully left her. "You don't have to explain everything all at once," he said after a moment. "We've got time." Eliza's lips curved faintly, not a full smile, but close. "I'm not used to that," she admitted. "Time?" She nodded. Caleb gave a small shrug. "Well," he said, a hint of warmth in his voice, "you've got plenty of it here." That earned a slightly clearer smile, the kind that reached her eyes, and for the first time, the quiet between them didn't feel like something she was holding on to. Out of habit. It felt like something she was slowly letting go of. Not all at once. Not completely, but enough to begin. Outside, the ranch stretched wide under the morning sun, calm and steady as it had always been, but inside the small house, something far more important had begun to grow. Not just trust, not just understanding, but a space where a voice once hidden away could finally start to belong. The days that followed didn't change all at once. There was no sudden shift, no moment where everything became easy or certain. Instead, change came quietly woven into the same routines they had already built, settling into the spaces between them like something patient and steady. Eliza still woke early. She still moved through the house with the same calm grace, tending to small tasks before Caleb even stepped inside. But now, there was something different in the air, something unspoken, yet unmistakable. Possibility. At first, she didn't speak much after that morning, not because she couldn't, but because she wasn't ready, and Caleb understood that without needing it explained. He didn't push her to talk, didn't ask questions that demanded answers. Instead, he met her where she was, just as he always had, through quiet gestures, steady presence, and the kind of patience that asks for nothing in return. But sometimes change begins in the smallest ways. One afternoon, while they were working near the barn, Caleb reached for a tool that wasn't where he expected it to be. He frowned slightly. Glancing around, "Eliza," he started, then paused as if catching himself. For a moment, the word hung in the air. Eliza, who had been standing just a few steps away, looked up. She hesitated. It was subtle but real, then softly, almost like testing something fragile. "Here." The word slipped out of her, quiet and careful. She held out the tool. Caleb looked at her, not surprised, but attentive. He took it from her hand, nodding once. "Thank you." He didn't make more of it than that. And somehow that made it easier. Eliza lowered her gaze slightly, but there was no retreat in her posture. No pulling away, just a quiet acknowledgement of what had happened. A step. Later that evening, they sat outside as they often did. The sky stretched wide above them, painted in soft colors as the sun began to set. Eliza held a small notebook in her hands, flipping it open and closed without writing anything. Caleb noticed. "You don't have to use that all the time anymore," he said gently. Eliza glanced at him. "I know," she replied. The words came a little easier this time. Still soft, but steadier. She looked back down at the notebook, her fingers resting along its edges. "It's just familiar." Caleb nodded. "That makes sense." There was no judgment in his voice, only understanding. For a while, they sat in silence again, but not the kind that held distance. This silence felt like space. Room to choose. Room to try. Eliza took a slow breath. Then, without looking at him, she spoke again. "I used to talk about everything." Caleb turned slightly, giving her his full attention, but not interrupting. "Even small things," she continued. "There's no one really cared about." Her voice carried a faint trace of something, uncertainty, maybe. "Or memory," I thought. "If I kept explaining, people would eventually listen." She let out a soft breath. They didn't. The words didn't carry bitterness. Just truth. Caleb leaned back slightly, his gaze steady on the horizon. "I'm listening now," he said. Simple. Honest. Eliza single quotes S fingers tightened slightly around the notebook. She didn't respond right away, But after a moment, she closed it and set it aside. That, more than anything, felt like an answer. The next few days brought more. Moments like that. Small words, short sentences, nothing forced. Sometimes she spoke, sometimes she didn't, and Caleb treated both the same. One morning, as they worked in the small garden they had planted together, Eliza knelt beside the growing plants, brushing her fingers lightly over the leaves. "They're growing fast," she said. Caleb smiled faintly. "They've got good care." Eliza glanced at him. There was something lighter in her expression now. Something less guarded, maybe. She replied, "It wasn't much, but it was natural, and that made all the difference, as time passed." Her voice came more often, still soft, still measured, but no longer hidden, not entirely. And Caleb never rushed her to say more, because he understood something important. This wasn't just about speaking, it was about feeling safe enough to be heard. One evening, as they stood near the fence watching the last light fade from the sky, Eliza spoke again, without hesitation this time. "It's quiet here," she said. Caleb nodded. "It always has been." She shook her head slightly. "Not like before." He looked at her. Eliza met his gaze, her expression calm, but open in a way it had never been before. "This kind of quiet doesn't feel empty." Caleb didn't answer right away, because he knew exactly what she meant. After a moment, he gave a small nod. "No," he said quietly, "it doesn't." They stood there together as the stars began to appear, the night settling gently around them. And for the first time, Eliza didn't hold on to silence as something she needed to hide behind. Instead, she stood within it, with a voice that was slowly, steadily becoming her own again. Morning on the ranch arrived the way it always had, soft light stretching across the land, the quiet hum of nature waking with the day. But now the stillness carried something new. It wasn't just peaceful, it was full. Caleb stood near the fence, watching the sun rise slowly over the horizon. This had always been his favorite time of day, the calm before work began, the moment where everything felt steady and certain. For years, he had stood here alone. Now he wasn't. "You're up early again." The voice came gently from behind him. Caleb turned. Eliza walked toward him, her steps unhurried, her expression relaxed. There was no hesitation in her voice now, no uncertainty in the way she spoke. It was still soft, still thoughtful, but it carried something it hadn't before. Caleb smiled faintly. "Some habits don't change," he replied. Eliza stopped beside him, her gaze drifting out over the fields. For a moment they stood in silence side by side, watching the day begin, but this silence felt different from anything that had come before. It wasn't a barrier. It wasn't protection. It was simply shared. "I like it here in the morning," she said after a moment. Caleb nodded. "Me too." He glanced at her briefly. "You've gotten used to it." It wasn't a question. Eliza smiled slightly. "I have." Her eyes moved across the land, the barn, the garden, the open fields stretching beyond. Everything about the ranch felt familiar to her now, not just as a place she lived, but as a place she belonged. Later that morning, the two of them worked together as they always did. The tasks hadn't changed: feeding the animals, checking the fences, tending to the small garden, but the way they moved through them had. There was more conversation now. Not constant, not overwhelming. Just natural. "Did you fix that hinge?" Eliza asked as they walked past the barn. Caleb nodded. "Yesterday." "I noticed," she said, a small hint of playfulness in her voice. "It's quieter." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "I thought you liked quiet." Eliza glanced at him, her smile soft but certain. "I do." She paused for a brief moment. "Just not the kind where nothing is heard." Caleb didn't respond right away. He didn't need to, because he understood exactly what she meant. By the afternoon, the sun hung warm overhead, casting light across the small garden they had planted together. The once bare patch of land was now alive with color green leaves, small blossoms, the promise of something growing stronger with each passing day. Eliza knelt beside it, brushing her fingers gently across the leaves. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. Caleb leaned against the fence nearby, watching her. "You made it that way." Eliza shook her head. "We did." She looked up at him. There was no hesitation in her gaze now. No guarded distance, just openness, just truth. Caleb stepped closer, his boots pressing softly into the earth. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Eliza stood, brushing the soil lightly from her hands. I used to think silence was the only way to feel safe, she said. Her voice was calm but steady. Caleb listened. I thought if I stayed quiet, nothing could hurt me. Nothing could reach me. She glanced down briefly, then back at him, but it also meant nothing could find me either. The words lingered between them. Honest. Unadden. Caleb nodded slowly. And now? He asked. Eliza's lips curved into a soft smile. Now I think being heard matters more. There was no fear in her voice. No doubt, only certainty, a quiet kind of strength. Caleb let out a slow breath, something warm settling in his chest. I'm glad you stayed, he said. Eliza held his gaze. So am I. The wind moved gently through the fields, carrying the scent of earth and sunlight. Somewhere in the distance, a horse shifted, the soft sound blending into the rhythm of the day. Life continued, just as it always had, but it didn't feel the same. Not anymore, because the house that once held only silence now carried laughter, soft but real, conversations simple but meaningful, and a presence that turned empty space into something warm. Caleb looked out over the ranch once more, then back at Eliza. He hadn't just found someone to share the work or the land. He had found someone who understood the quiet and showed him that it didn't have to mean loneliness. Eliza stepped closer, her hand brushing lightly against his. Not by accident. Not uncertain but intentional. And Caleb didn't pull away, because this everything they had built together was no longer something fragile. It was something real, something steady, something that had grown not from words alone, but from patience, trust, and the courage to be truly seen. And as the sun continued its slow path across the sky, one thing became clear. This wasn't just the end of a story. It was the beginning of a life where silence no longer meant being unheard, but simply being at peace.